welcome back to those who have been with us since this morning, and welcome to those who are joining this session for the first time. I hope that you all had a good coffee break and interesting conversations during the breakout chat session, coffee break sessions. Following this morning's stimulating discussions on the platform economy, we would like to now shift our focus to another group of workers and sectors of the economy that have also been hugely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. In this session, session 4, we will discuss essential migrant workers and the future of work. My name is Ito Peng, and I am a professor of sociology and public policy at the Department of Sociology and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Whoa, that was quite a mouthful here. In this session, we have 3 distinguished scholars and researchers, Philip Martin, Margaret Walton-Roberts, and Sabrina Marchetti. They will be presenting their work on the essential migrant workers. I suspect this session will also generate an enthusiastic conversations and discussions at the end. So I'm not going to spend much time in giving introductory note, except to say that a couple of sentences about each of the presenters, and then ask them to give 15 to 20-minute presentation, and then follow it up with questions and answers and discussions. May I ask you to please send your questions and comments in the chat box? I will keep track of them and try to organize and say it at the end of the presentations. I'm sure there will be a lot of discussions even after the session is over. So I would encourage you to stay and join the coffee break session after this session. I'll give you more information about this at the end of this session. So let me now quickly introduce the 3 presenters. Philip Martin is the Professor Emeritus of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California, Davis. He is the editor of Rural Migration News and the author of numerous research publications on migration and farm labor. His most recent book is The Prosperity Paradox: Fewer and More Vulnerable Farm Workers, and it's published out of the Oxford University Press. Margaret Walton-Roberts is the Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University and an affiliate of the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Ontario. Margaret's current research focuses on international migration, and healthcare professionals within Asia and from Asia to North America and Europe. Finally, Sabrina Marchetti is an associate professor in sociology at the Foscari University of Venice. Sabrina mainly specializes on issues of gender, racism, labor, and migration, with a specific focus on the question of migrant domestic workers. So we are still waiting for Philip to join us. I don't see his name here. There might be some technical issues in connecting through Zoom link. So why don't we start with Margaret with a presentation, and hopefully Philip will join us later. So Margaret, would you like to start?
Yes, I'm very pleased to be involved. So thank you to Anna and the Center for inviting me. And I'm very pleased to see so many people on this session, and thank you for joining me. I'm going to do the typical professor thing on Zoom and ask, can you see my screen? We good? Thank you.
Margaret,
Okay.
sorry, if you just quickly go into the display settings and change it to presenter view. Perfect.
Great.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, thank you very much for the invitation. This has been this is such an interesting conference, and I'm sort of looking forward to following up on so many of the other sessions. So we're looking at kind of essential workers, and I'm going to present on migration and the future of healthcare work, linking with COVID through the idea of how to build back better. Briefly, I'll be going through, touching on the idea of the future of healthcare work, touching on some ideas around human-robot interaction, automation, and restructuring of the professions. Briefly thinking about migrant healthcare labor and how it's really part of much more broader changes in terms of the workplace. And then thinking about COVID-19 and how it's revealed and intensified human resources for health challenges. And then think about building back better and concluding. So let's begin thinking about the future of healthcare work. Human-robot interaction is a really fascinating area that has focused on how automation and roboticization might inform healthcare work. But what's interesting when analyzing the work of many scholars in this area, especially obviously Japan is a really important country in this regard, because it's really at the lead edge of the sort of super aging population, and their engagement with nursing and care has really embraced the idea of robots, just as Japanese society has more broadly. And when reading a lot of the work around the Japanese government's engagement and scholars and others looking at robot-human interaction, what's interesting is the sort of fairly profound argument that technical solutions are really about social and ethical issues, and the idea that humans need to be at the heart of these production developments, and that machinery, including robotics, really must be seen as used as supportive or assistive systems. And in the area of health and care more generally, this is really significant in how it plays out in terms of labor and the practitioner roles of healthcare. So here's one of the more famous robotic nurses, here seen as a lift assist. And often these kinds of technologies are not considered to be used in isolation. They're very much working alongside workers, healthcare workers. And so the argument is that the introduction of robots into healthcare is more about task shifting and not the replacement of workers, and how care robots really help open up this sort of technologically facilitated idea of global care chains, but also can have profound implications in terms of the nature of the labor force. And here's a very interesting paper looking at the role of healthcare of care workers in long-term care in Japan and their interaction with robots. And again, this idea about them representing a new assemblage of techno welfare because of this very intimate integration between humans and robots in the provision of intimate care. In terms of automation and artificial intelligence, what's clear, and this comes from a report in the Economic and Social Reports just last month by Frank and others, and they have looked at the influence of automation for the last 20 years or more. And what I've highlighted there in yellow is professions that are in nursing, professions in health, except nursing, technical occupations in health, and professional occupations in law, social, community, and government services, and assisting occupations in support of health services. And all of those highlighted occupations have seen a growth in the number of people employed. And so the idea that automation might reduce the number of people in health and care is certainly bucked by this long-term analysis of the role of automation. In fact, these occupations are shown to be significant growth populations going forward. Also, in terms of artificial intelligence, there's some interesting examples of how AI is being utilized within the healthcare sector. And this is one really interesting example. A Boston-based company called IntelliCare So it's a Boston nursing staffing agency present in about 20 US states. And in 2020, they ended as one of the fastest growing companies in Massachusetts and the US. This company uses advanced algorithms in combination with gig economics. And so kind of a very interesting interaction. And they use these technologies to strategically allocate staffing resources. And this has been very attractive because nurses are able to control their own schedules, and the demand for the services of IntelliCare increased about 106% between 2019 and 2020. And so the importance of this kind of gig economics, or these agency type nursing and smart scheduling, is really interesting, and we'll come back to that subsequently as well. Also, there's obviously a great deal of work in the area of technology and the restructuring of the professions. And of course, the work of Richard and Daniel Susskind in this domain is interesting. So in their book, The Future of the Professions, what they argue is that we're going to really see transformations in terms of teleprofessionalism is going to be unrestrained by geography. It's going to be a sort of disintermediated relationship between those seeking services and those professionals able to provide it. And that disintermediation is going to create opportunities for paraprofessionals to step in. And those paraprofessionals then sort of re-intermediate that interaction between the client and the service provider, the professional. So we can think about that in terms of surgeons who can kind of decompose the work that they do into stages, and they can bring in paraprofessionals. And interestingly, in the book that the Suskins write, they talk about the idea of these paraprofessionals, these intermediaries coming in and providing the kind of empathy, the bedside manner, providing the information that a patient needs that a surgeon may not have the time to necessarily provide. And there's lots of examples of this already happening. Medical tourism has provided a really rich field of analysis where we see all kinds of levels of intermediation in terms of facilitators and others. And my colleague Heidi Kasper has written about this. And also many of you may already be familiar with the idea of the nurse navigator for say cancer patients, where they have somebody who they can connect when they're feeling confused and lost and dealing with their oncologists and surgeons and others. Also, there's been a recognition of the role of nurses within this kind of transformation moving forward. And the argument is that many nurses will eventually become higher level delegators, overseeing patient care, coordinating other workers and technologies to ensure that care is delivered appropriately. And this is bringing up all kinds of new nursing roles. So certainly we can see how technology is going to inform the future of work, but I would argue in the area of healthcare, there are going to be shifts and changes, but the actual area of that work is still significant in terms of the human input. Link this with the role of the migrant worker within the field of healthcare. And here I'm sort of drawing on the work of Neil Coe, Phil Kelly and Henry Young in their sort of analysis of what's happening in terms of labour markets. And their argument is there is a wider set of transformations occurring in the labour market that migrants are kind of a part of. So it's not as if migrants are causing these changes. They're really more emblematic of generally somewhat deteriorating conditions of work. But there are some areas where this is relevant, and it's highly relevant in terms of healthcare workers. So thinking about these deteriorating and precarious working conditions, what we see is that healthcare workers face increased patient workloads, long working hours, shift work, poor infrastructure and staff shortages, budgetary constraints, and it negatively affects working conditions. This is really pronounced in some regions. If we think about African hospitals, for example, it's very clear that this has been an experience of healthcare workers there. And of course, that then is one of the main migrant drivers. Also, though, in more developed economies, such as the USA, we also see health workers facing these same conditions, relative conditions. And in fact, in the US, there's been an argument that healthcare professionals face moral injury because they are trying to make a healthcare system work that is built to fail. It's built to fail a large percentage of the population that they have to deal that needs healthcare, and that this private sector healthcare is not working effectively. And that, of course, negatively influences retention. So you can see the interaction of these things occurring. Also, what we've seen is that in Canada, this is the case. This is an article from the Globe and Mail from last month, arguing that 4,000 of Quebec's 61,000 nurses left their jobs between March and December of 2020. In the same period, 2,800 nurses quit. That was a 43% increase. And we've seen nurses on sick leave. That's a 28% increase. Also aligned with this precarious and negative working conditions is subcontracting and agency work. So again, referencing that in telecare. But what's interesting is that nurses choose, evidence suggests that nurses choose agency work for a variety of reasons, including shift flexibility and, interestingly, avoidance of stressful relationships at the work site. And this is evidence from a UK study, but also this article looking at the case of Canada suggests that this is also clear, that nurses use agency working so that they can protect themselves from being too deeply embedded in the kind of toxic problems they may face in the work environment. The issue of expanding care work and places of work is important to understand in terms of the nature of employment. So this information comes from CIHR data on nursing. It's just a graphic to illustrate the three main places of work for healthcare workers. They are the hospital setting, in community, and in long-term care. About half of nurses work in the hospital setting, and then distribution across community and long-term care for other nurses. And depending on the cadre of nurses, so regulated nurses tending to be more present in the hospitals, nurse practitioners more present in community, and registered practical nurses often working in long-term and other scenarios. Why it's important to think about the place of work is because we need to recognize the significance of an aging society. That is having an impact in terms of the nature and the sites and the skill mix of those involved in care and health work care. And it's particularly important because we need to understand how regulated and unregulated workers kind of connect together. And this is with regards to what we call personal support workers, who are unregulated workers who tend to provide care in various contexts, but especially in long-term care facilities and other scenarios. And they are increasingly engaged in providing complex care. And this is something that's in some ways missed, because we tend to think about our healthcare system according to the sort of the major stakeholders. And so this is an image from 2006, and you don't see long-term care homes in this graphic at all. Okay, so they're not represented, but they are increasingly important sites now, and this has become clear during the pandemic. And this chart just gives us an idea of some of the range of those new sites, if you want, that we need to pay attention to for the provision of care in terms of different kinds of facilities, such as independent living communities, assisted living facilities, residential care, continuing care, and nursing homes. And you can see when it talks about the mix of workers employed, that personal support workers, these unregulated professionals, are very important in this area. So the place of work is changing, and we need to think about that. There's also the globalization of health, and this is evident in terms of BPO or back processing offices, and the way in which health industry capital itself is seeking out profits, working through merger and acquisitions and geographical expansion. And so this is another element of that kind of deteriorating workforce, because labor becomes another cost to be cut. And this, we can see this in terms of private long-term care facilities. So connecting that kind of globalization of health and the private sector investments that go ahead. And this is a graphic of the Ontario, the distribution of Ontario long-term care homes. And you can see that about 59% are private. A very important area to discuss is segmentation and inequality, and I'll try to continue as quickly as I can. But first of all, segmentation by gender is very apparent, and this is looking at physicians' salaries, the income that women earn is less than men for all ethnic groups. And this is looking at the same for surgeons and physicians. And so there's certainly a gendered income imbalance in terms of the higher end of the healthcare professionals. And when we look at nurses and personal support workers, and what I've done here is I've drawn in data for Ontario. I've graphically represented the distribution in terms of the yellow is personal support workers, the grey is licensed practical nurses or registered practical nurses in the Ontario context. The orange is registered nurses and the blue is nurse practitioners. And so nurse practitioners have the broadest scope, say, you know, the highest, if you like, regulatory profession in nurses. I've put these together because they do operate together. And I just want to draw your attention to when we look at the numbers across Ontario, we get there that classic hourglass of the labour market, right? It's sort of pinched in the middle at the licensed practical nurses. But when you look at the immigrants who are represented in these occupations, what we have more there is a pyramid. We have a much greater overrepresentation of migrants in the bottom end of the labour market. And this is important to understand the interaction of these different regulated professions because they work together in these sites of care provision. So interprofessional collaboration between personal support workers, between and within nursing cadres, as well as with doctors, is increasingly the way to go in terms of healthcare provisioning. And we need that collaboration to transcend negative stratification, to improve care, and to develop best practices in terms of a supportive environment. And so there's numerous articles, and this is a journal of interprofessional care, which is really a significant venue for looking at this new approach to how we manage healthcare. And just recently on intra-professional collaboration within nursing cadres, there's a very interesting report just come out from the Canadian Nursing Association by Joan Almost. So just to briefly go through, as most people are probably aware, COVID-19 has revealed and intensified a lot of the challenges that have been faced. Shortages of healthcare workers became more apparent. We've seen a report from the Registered Nurse Association of Ontario that's indicated how stressful this has been for workers and how people feel their mental health has been negatively affected, how they don't feel like they have adequate supports. The International Council of Nurses issued a report where they said there's a global phenomena of mass trauma being experienced by nurses, and they estimated that about 10% of all confirmed infections are healthcare workers. And yet we still don't really have adequate standardized data collection in this area. So recognizing those really vulnerable, the kind of exposure that healthcare workers are facing and the fact that we're not necessarily getting a handle on that. And that there's all kinds of other issues around burnout and inadequate PPE, violence, discrimination. And just to link to this then, you know, when we think about migration, again, this has become really evident that many OECD countries depend on migrant workers in the healthcare sector. The OECD has been identifying this for years. They have issued numerous reports, and this report just recently that they put out looking at the contribution of migrant doctors and nurses during COVID-19 is full of lots of really interesting information. But especially they've argued that countries have recognized the significance of migrant workers, and they've identified a number of policy issues that have been adopted in various countries to accelerate and more fully integrate internationally educated health professionals into their healthcare service. On the sending side, however, there's also been struggles. The Philippines initially banned the deployment of nurses from the country, and India has itself been kind of revising how some controls on doctors leaving India to go to the US, and also they have some kinds of different policies of management, especially for nurses going to the Middle East. But as we see here from the president of the Filipino Nurses Association, they say it's all very well for the country to do this, but unless they are willing to improve conditions in the place of work, they're not going to prevent the outflow of workers. Just quickly to start to wrap up, there has been some interesting system responses. In Ontario, the government has increased the salaries, the pay for personal support workers. In the UK, the number of people applying to do nursing has increased quite significantly. And here in Ontario, these are application numbers to the higher education sector. The applications to nursing programs has increased by nearly over 70%. And so some have called this the Fauci effect. And so this is a promising outcome of the pandemic. And just coming to close, obviously what we want to say is we need to build back better. We need to start really paying much more attention to a lot of the multilateral initiatives that have been developed in terms of the World Health Organization's high-level commission on health, employment and economic growth, especially the International Platform on Health Worker Mobility. We need to really double down on our engagement with ethical recruitment models, health solidarity, bilateral fair migration schemes. There are all kinds of initiatives that researchers can begin to look at and policymakers can learn from that can promote global health and gender justice. And of course, in migration terms, we need more permanent migration, career laddering, gendered audits, and we must continue to focus on fair access to professions. So just to wrap up, sorry I've gone over, but I want to just say healthcare is subjected to technological change, but what we're seeing is task shifting rather than displacement. Migrant health workers are part of a wider set of changes in terms of transformations in working conditions. COVID-19 has revealed and intensified a lot of these processes, and building back better must recognize the importance of international health workers. It must interpret them as part of their domestic labor markets. They have to connect the dots between national, international labor supply, review the nature of internal occupational segmentation, enhance fair migration, fair access to professions and career laddering and decent work agendas. And so with that, I'll close and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Margaret, for this very informative presentation of the healthcare workers and COVID-19. I see that Philip has joined us, but let's keep the order as it is, because I think Sabrina's presentation actually connects very closely with the Margaret's presentation. So I would like to now ask Sabrina to give us your presentation. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Good morning, actually, for you. For me, it's evening. I'm speaking from Italy. So I would like to thank Anna Trandafilidu and a wonderful team for the invitation and for organizing this panel and this conference, actually. So my presentation, here we go. Okay. Is about migrant domestic workers and caregivers, mainly looking at them from the European perspective and more in general. As a way to begin, I would like to show you this. This was one of the many memes which during last spring, at the very beginning of the lockdown phase, circulated on Facebook and got my attention. It said, our cleaning lady just called and told us she will be working from home and she will send us instructions on what to do. The meme was, of course, hilarious, suggesting the image of this, we can imagine, upper-class woman in panic because she didn't know how to clean her own house. At the same time, the meme had more painful implications, suggesting that since actually this cleaning lady of the meme could not actually work from home, she was in a big trouble. So she go to work anyway, despite the lockdown order. Will she be paid if she stayed at home? But most importantly, is she actually allowed to go to work? Or shall we say that she has to work because her work is essential? In order to answer to these many questions, we have to open a Pandora box, which has to do with inequalities between different types of work, and especially between the kind of people or social groups which are most commonly associated to these jobs. Before that, I would like to reflect on the meaning of a very important element in these questions, the notion of essential work. It is quite striking to me how the word essential has had a reversal of meaning probably since the COVID pandemic began. In the past, labor legislations in different countries, I suspect, aimed to protect some services for the threat of labor strikes or other reasons for interruptions, thus to guarantee citizens in their fundamental rights in every condition. Such indispensable services, as they were called, were indeed codified by the law and usually had to do with security, health, food, transportation, social assistance, education, media, and communication. We have noticed how, after the outbreak of this pandemic, we have started to talk about essential workers as those who are authorized to continue working in any condition. With a different emphasis, we even have said that essential workers are those who have the responsibility, probably, to continue to work, who are committed to continue to work. There is a difference, however. Some essential work can be conducted remotely. Administrative staff, teachers, IT technicians are able to continue provide at least partially their work, their essential work, while staying at home. These workers have the possibility to meet at the same time the requirements of social isolation and the need to continue working in essential sectors. Here we come to the importance of what we call teleworkability, which is the quality of those occupations which can be transferred without trouble from the presence mode to the remote mode. In this pandemic world in which all of a sudden we find ourselves, teleworkability is probably the most precious quality there is. As we know, this quality is usually a characteristic of jobs held by people in higher level of education with higher salaries and more social protection. However, the majority of the essential work does not have this quality. It is instead physical, manual work that must be done in person and not through the screen of a computer. These jobs are also the lowest paid, do not enjoy allowances and protections, employment is short and temporary. Many have noticed the striking feminization and racializations of what I would call not reworkable essential work. Physical essential work, as we could say, is what Carol Wolkowitz calls body work, since it involves the approaching, touching, leaning, and manipulating of other people's bodily parts. But even within the physical essential work, there are differences. In fact, during lockdown, some of the professions most at risk, such as dentists, have been able to remain closed. General practitioners, doctors, have been able to transfer some of their tasks remotely, by telephone or by email. This has not been the case for some of the categories of the physical essential workers, such as nurses, with the exception of the cases for robot nurses, as Margaret described, health personnel and caregivers that she has spoken about. We could actually say that this category of people probably had the responsibility to continue to work as before. In recent months, there's been much talk on how these essential sectors correspond to what is called social reproduction work, which is the work necessary for the livelihood and well-being of society, both at the material and symbolic level. We know that paid forms of this work are occupied by people belonging to more marginalized groups, subject to stigma and discrimination of various kinds. Amongst them, as you know, I will focus on migrants. Migrant domestic workers has been demonstrated to be one of the categories most affected by the pandemic at the international level. It is also important to remember that in general, state policies have a crucial role in shaping the condition of these workers, these migrant workers, since they are simultaneously affected by government's approaches both towards migrants and towards different types of labor. In Europe, labor legislations protecting this category are lacking. Overall, it must be noticed that labor laws on domestic workers almost never grant them the same rights as other categories of workers. For example, they do not grant them the right to a paid sick leave, which has been, of course, very important in these pandemic months. In the slide, you find some more details. Domestic workers can be generally seen as what Russell Parreñas called partial citizens in most countries. Their status is highly precarious when it comes to residence permit, family reunification, access to property, healthcare, education, financial credit, and so forth. In Europe, such limitations also apply to the many EU citizens who move from Eastern countries to the West for work, and which compose the majority of those employed in domestic and care work sectors, especially in the case of women. Crucially, it is important to say that most migrants in this sector are forced into a documented condition. In Denmark, Germany, Ireland, and the Netherlands, they're not allowed to apply for a residence permit as worker in this sector. In Belgium and the UK, for example, the permit is tied to the first employer and will be lost in the case they want to change employer. In Italy and Greece, there is a quota limitation on the number and on the nationalities of workers that can apply for a permit to work in this sector each year. The main point I want to make, as a way maybe to think about possible future policies addressing these workers, relates to the way different countries during the pandemic months have addressed domestic and care workers in their policy measures that they've taken in the, I will focus on the spring 2020. This is also part of a paper I'm working on with Merita Jokela, my colleague from Finland. When we look at whether state policies have or have not taken into account and supported these workers, we see how the fact that they are positioned at the edge of the various discrimination that marginal subjects are facing during this pandemic is affecting the outcome of policies. In fact, the convergence between there being workers at the lowest ladder of the care provision and there being partial citizens or undocumented migrants puts them at risk of being systematically excluded from policy initiatives. Some countries have taken specific measures targeting migrants during the outbreak in spring 2020. In fact, these measures, there have been measures supporting migrants that had a pending status. For example, migrants with an expiring visa or migrants waiting for procedures of any kind, including expulsions. I put some examples from France, Spain, and Portugal in the slide. The problem here with these measures, in my view, is that these categories of migrants do not correspond to the profile of migrant domestic care workers, who are often undocumented for many years, do not have opportunity to apply for regularization. So let's say they do not have any pending procedure, so to say. At the same time, measures taken by governments to protect workers, so another type of measures, another set of measures, really made explicit mention of domestic and care workers. They are generally excluded. These categories generally excluded by all measures that are addressed employees of companies, and it was also unclear whether they are included in measures for self-employed or general workers due to the specificities of their status. In Austria, for example, migrant domestic and workers, even though they are self-employed, cannot access COVID-19 support because they do not have an Austrian tax number or bank account. In Germany, migrant domestic care workers are also excluded because they are usually posted workers or self-employed paying taxes, but in their home country. These two cases exemplify the condition of the many migrant domestic care workers who have a residence work permit in Europe, and yet are what we are called partial citizens in the sense they are not entitled in Europe to have the same social and health rights of the country's citizens, although they are not undocumented. Finally, when it comes to a third type of measures, which is the measures indeed targeting domestic and care workers, we see that in several countries, the government has asked them to stay home. We know that some governments have asked these workers to stay home in order to avoid the risk of contagion. This, for them, has implied a loss of worked hours and payment. In reaction to this, for example, in Belgium, the corona unemployment also applied to domestic and care workers to cover the payment of the lost hours. In France, domestic workers' employers had 80% reimbursement of the cost of the payment for the not worked hours. In Spain, there was the extension of the COVID-19 unemployment benefit to the sector too. This was quite an achievement after the open letter promoted by several domestic and care workers organizations. And it was actually the first time in history that the Spanish government has included this sector in an unemployment benefit measure. Likewise, in Italy, it was also after a grassroots mobilization with an appeal drawing attention to the difficult situation of domestic care workers that the government expanded the emergency income to the category of domestic workers. Also, the ILO headquarters in Italy had mobilized for that. And in the summer 2020, so a little bit later on the time frame I'm focusing, the Italian government has launched a regularization for undocumented migrants in this sector, but unfortunately they did not get many applications to regularize. So coming to the end, all these initiatives to support domestic care workers who stop working or reduce their working hours have been very important. However, in my view, here we find again that such coverage may not in the end apply to the many undocumented and informal workers whose numbers are so high in this domestic and caregiving sector. For example, all measures and many measures are often modeled on the idea of a per-hour worker who can remain in their homes when doesn't go to work. Yet, as we know, in the aging societies of Europe, the majority of migrant caregivers for the elders are actually live-in and do not have other places where to stay beside the employers' homes. For that reason, during lockdowns, these workers actually found themselves in the opposite situation, having to renounce their free time and personal life in order to remain home with the employers' families. This is only one of the many examples why policy measures taken by European governments are not particularly favorable to migrant domestic care workers who, due to the intersection of the precarious conditions at different levels, as informal workers and undocumented migrants, cannot fully take advantage of the support programs undertaken by governments. Coming to the end, let us try to see what are the lessons that we can learn from what happened during last spring for future policies. In fact, we're looking at the somehow exceptional measures taken by some states after open letters and workers' campaigns. I'd like to recognize that these initiatives had a great value at the symbolic level, emphasizing how domestic workers are workers like all the others. However, at the same time, they have had a little impact in practical terms due to the generalized precarity of these workers, as we have discussed. As we also have seen, even in European countries where COVID-19 support initiatives were most generous, the actual condition of work and of life as migrants and basic care providers prevents them to fully enjoy these opportunities. In this light, I can conclude by saying that domestic workers' experience throughout the pandemic is magnifying the intersectional inequality which chronically determine the social, economic, and citizen positions as migrants, domestic workers in European societies. It also confirms the structural inequality of the system of care provision which dominates in Europe, which relies on temporary, precarious, invisible work of the many migrant women from neighboring and distant countries and on the multiple marginalization.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, for the very, very thoughtful presentation. I also see that people are beginning to post questions and comments on the chat box. Please feel free to continue doing that. Now, I would like to ask Philip Martin to give his presentation.
So I'm Phil Martin. I want to thank Anna and everyone. I apologize. I had written down 12 o'clock California time and not 12 o'clock East Coast time. And so I apologize for coming on late and actually being on a different computer than I planned to be on. But let me take my few minutes and talk about labor migration after COVID with agriculture. And in a way, there's some similarities to the two previous presentations. I mean, on the one hand, agriculture, like healthcare, is a sector that's got a lot of government intervention in every country. So it's in agriculture, government does one thing and it has an effect, and we come in with another policy. And in healthcare, it's the same thing, heavily regulated and lots of internal contradictions. Domestic workers, on the other hand, are something that we have just heard are not terribly regulated. That is, it's often a private sector thing. It's important to recognize, I think, with domestic workers that they're not distributed uniformly across households in a society. In fact, it's only United States, for example, has 130 million households. And the maximum number of in-home care workers that you can find is roughly 1 million. So that means the great, great majority of people do not have them. But what I will do is talk about agriculture. So agriculture is a big employer. Roughly 1/4 of the world's workers are employed in agriculture. And agriculture is a kind of an 80-20 sector, which means that there's a whole lot of farms, but they're small and they don't produce much of the output. So the biggest farms, the largest 20% of farms, account for 80% or more of the output. And it's on those large farms that most of the hired workers are concentrated. So when you look at agriculture, averages are typically not very useful because they include lots of small subsistence farms, or in rich countries, they're hobby and retirement operations. They don't hire many workers. They don't account for much of the output. And there's a rule of thumb in agriculture that if you fly into a country and you don't know anything about it, and you want to know if it's rich or poor, you simply ask, what share of the people in this country are employed in agriculture? If it's over 50%, it's a poor country, no exceptions. If it's less than 5%, it's a rich country, no exceptions. So what's the rule? As a country gets richer, the share of people employed in agriculture goes down. But within richer countries, the share of the work done by hired or wage workers goes up. And that's especially true in one subsector of agriculture, the production of fruits and vegetables and horticultural specialties, everything from flowers to nurseries. And those hired workers get ever more, so agriculture goes down, the hired worker share goes up, and the hired workers become ever more vulnerable. Because who are they? They're local workers who can't find non-farm jobs. Non-farm jobs offer higher wages and better benefits and more opportunities for upward mobility, and they're guest workers. And they're sometimes unauthorized workers from poorer countries. If we take just the United States, all three countries, Canada, United States, and Mexico, rely on roughly the same hired farm workforce, which is rural Mexicans. Canada, they're about a third of the seasonal workers. In the United States, they're about 70%. And of course, they're about 100% in Mexico. And if you look at two sectors in North America that have integrated a lot under NAFTA, which started in 1994, one is autos, in which parts and cars go back and forth across the borders. The other is agriculture, in which you can find Canadian tomatoes in the United States or Canadian blueberries. You can find Mexican avocados in all three countries. But the difference is, of course, that cars in Mexico are put together by Mexican workers, cars in Canada are put together by Canadian workers, and cars in the US by American workers. But in all three countries, Mexican-born workers typically will work in labor-intensive agriculture. The second big thing, of course, is COVID. What was the response? I mean, as everyone said, food is essential, but there were very uneven impacts on food sector employment. We had, for example, the number of jobs in meatpacking going up, the number of jobs in restaurants going down. And the big question in both the United States, Europe, and other countries was, will jobless people shift within the food system? Will people who lost jobs in restaurants go into the fields or go into meatpacking plants? The answer is no. And that's true for a lot of reasons. For the one thing is restaurants are in urban areas by and large, farm jobs are in rural areas. That means you've got to get temporary housing. You have to find those employers who hire workers. And it should be emphasized that employers really prefer guest workers to local workers. So we really didn't see in 2020 many big changes to farm wages, some changes to working conditions, more protected personal equipment. But the main takeaway from this is going to be, what are the effects of COVID? And what COVID does in agriculture, just like many other industries, is it speeds up changes that are already happening. And what are they? In agriculture, it's mechanization, it's guest workers, and it's more imports. So let me just run through those in a little more detail, but you've now got the essence of what the talk is. Every diagram that you can see that has the share of employment in agriculture on the y-axis, when the income of the country on the x-axis has exactly the same negative slope. So some countries, the share of people in agriculture goes down quickly. Some countries, it's slower. But the basic idea is, as countries get richer, the share of workers employed in agriculture goes down. And that's what I call the prosperity paradox, this idea that as a country gets richer, the share of labor employed in agriculture goes down, the share of farm work done by hired workers goes up, and those hired workers tend to be more vulnerable. both because they are local workers who, for whatever reason, whether it's discrimination, lack of language, lack of skills, can't get a non-farm job, and workers from lower wage countries. If we look at the United States, which has a fairly large agricultural system, traditionally we had 3 different farm labor systems. And we had big families who had lots of children who did farm work, and they mostly produced only for the family, because after all, there wasn't really much incentive in the early 1800s to produce for cities. The largest city in the US was New York, and it had like 30,000 residents. So transport costs were high, and you were self-sufficient farmers. In the southern states, of course, it was different. There you were producing a non-perishable commodity, primarily cotton and sometimes tobacco, to ship mostly to Europe or to the northern states. And in a country that offered free land, you needed some way to keep people available. And of course, we had slavery in order to do that. It was really in the Western states that developed the farm labor system, which is true in the United States today and is spreading, I think, to many industrial countries. So what happened in the Western states? You had large farms, and they depended on migrants. And who were the first migrants? Well, they were from China. They were imported to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad got finished, the workers got laid off, and they moved into cities. The Chinese moved into cities. They were made the scapegoats for lower wages. They were driven out of the cities, and they became migrant workers. And what was the whole idea was you hired workers only when they were needed, and then laid them off when they weren't, and then they fended for themselves. And so you set in motion a migrant labor system that said, we won't be responsible in the off season, but we will expect you to show up when people are there. And so the whole story of the Western United States migrant labor system is we had waves of immigrants. In every case, you got roughly 10 to 20 years of work out of a wave of newcomers who arrived. They worked, their children educated in the United States refused to follow their parents into the field, so you needed to find a new group of people who were new to the agriculture system, for which the wages in agriculture were a step up from wherever they are. The thing that was unusual is in this whole 150-year history, there was only one time that the majority of migrant workers, at least in the Western states, were US citizens. And that was in the 1930s when there was a Dust Bowl and a lot of people moved west, and it produced all the literature such as The Grapes of Wrath. So today, farm workers in the United States, for example, are getting older. The average age of US workers is about 42. The average age of hired farm workers is about 41. That was never the case before. It used to be farm workers would be in their high 20s, but they're getting older. They're still roughly half unauthorized. They're typically settled in one place. And most unauthorized farm workers in the US have US-born children. And if history is any guide, those children will not be following their parents into the fields. But what does COVID then do to this farm labor system that has evolved over the years? It does 3 things. It accelerates mechanization, replacing people with machines. It accelerates the use of guest workers because we'll talk more about this, but guest workers are what the term in agriculture is, they're loyal. They don't go off and try to get another job that pays higher wages. And it accelerates imports of labor-intensive commodities from other regions. The first, of course, is mechanization. It's always said machines don't get sick. The difficulty with machines in agriculture is that the machines are not near as good as people at distinguishing ripe and unripe things. There has been lots and lots of mechanization. After all, 200 years ago, over 90% of people in most of what are today the industrial countries worked in agriculture. Today, it's less than 5%, but people are still much more sophisticated than any machine. Many commodities that people did not, that it was widely said could not be harvested by machine, now are. So there's lots of olives being produced in California, which are harvested mechanically. Carrots are by and large harvested mechanically. Tomato, and then of course in nurseries they're moving these plants. This is a little $25,000 robot that works 24/7. It's cheap, and it is displacing lots of people in nurseries. But there's a huge difference between the use of labor-saving automation in agriculture and in something like defense. It turns out many of the ideas for agricultural innovation actually come from the military research. And in the military, the idea is performance, not cost. Spend $1 million, save a soldier. In agriculture is exactly the opposite. It's all about cost and not performance. It doesn't matter if you get all the apples on the tree. The machine's got to be cheap, it's got to be durable, it can't damage the plant or damage the fruit. So the first big trend is mechanization. The second is more guest workers. And that might be a surprise given how high the unemployment rate went. But as we saw in both the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, it was hard to get unemployed local workers to go out and fill jobs in agriculture. So the US had a new record high last year of 275,000 jobs certified. And it looks like we're ahead again in 2021. We're up about 20% in terms of the number of jobs certified. So why would the dependence on guest workers go up in the middle of a pandemic when there is high unemployment and where guest workers often do cost more than US workers? And this takes a little bit of thinking, but I think it's pretty intuitive once you think about it. If you're hiring guest workers, the employer picks the worker and uses sort of positive networks to get more workers. That is, you ask the best workers you already have to bring their relatives into the crew. And if you do that, your current workers will train the new workers. If you're hiring local workers, the worker selects the employer. And you can get potential negative networks. So for example, in the strawberry industry, you often see 60-year-olds out there. And if you look at the payroll records, they actually don't pick fast enough to earn the minimum wage. Now they get the minimum wage because the employer makes up. So the question is, why would a strawberry grower keep the 60 and 70-year-old workers? Well, the answer is they carpool with 30-year-olds. And so you hire the whole family in order to get the faster, younger workers. The buzzword in the industry is that H-2A workers are reliable, they're loyal, they're willing to work extra, and they provide a form of labor insurance, which you don't have with US workers. In other words, US workers could find a better job and move on. So we have more mechanization, more guest workers, and the third element is more imports. Most people don't realize how much produce is already imported. In the case of the United States, half of all the fresh fruit and a third of the fresh vegetables are imported. And since fruits and vegetables are over 90% water, most of them, you're basically moving water. And Mexico is the source of half of the fresh fruit imports and about 3/4 of the vegetable imports, most of which come into the US by truck. So what does Mexico export to the United States that's labor intensive? Well, the big three are tomatoes, avocados, and berries. Those are roughly half of all the fruit and vegetable imports that the United States takes from Mexico. And back in 1990, remember Mexican President Salinas said, you should support NAFTA because Mexico is either going to export tomatoes or tomato pickers to the US. And look at what's happened in the last 30 years. Mexico is the world's largest exporter of tomatoes. And we are consuming 60% of the tomatoes consumed in the US come from Mexico, a few come from Canada, and the rest are produced within the US. So there's a lot of trade-offs in farm labor. When you look at how this will evolve in the future, remember people say machines don't get sick, but the problem with machines is that they become a fixed cost. So if you buy a machine, costs $300,000 or $400,000, you have to pay for that, even if weather destroys the crop. If you hire workers and there's no work, then you don't pay wages. There's also this question of how much consumer acceptance there's going to be of machine harvested produce. The assumption is that guest workers will be available because of wage differences. And the question is, how do you protect, whether you call the guest workers loyal or indentured, how do you protect them and how do you keep them safe? And that's an ongoing issue in discussions of guest worker programs. And then with imports, we have trade in place of migration, but of course there's always food safety and food security concerns. There's also an issue about whether the importers of fresh produce from abroad should be responsible for the wages and working conditions of workers employed on farms abroad. And I guess a final note that I think is worth thinking about when we think about COVID and going forward, we know that food is essential, but exactly which foods? Take an example. I mean, it's the same, you could make the same case for care workers, et cetera. One of the most labor-intensive commodities that you can have is fresh red raspberries. If you actually look at who buys them, about 70% are bought by people with incomes of over $200,000 a year. So in a pandemic, does it make sense to open up otherwise closed borders to make sure that people get their fresh raspberries? You could ask the same thing about strawberries and other things as well. There are, in short, a lot of trade-offs with thinking about how to move forward after COVID. But if I can leave you with one thing, it's trends already underway. Mechanization, guest workers, and imports are likely to continue. But exactly how they shake out for any individual commodity is something that we'll have to wait and see what happens. So let me stop there and thank you, and apologize again for getting times wrong.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your presentation. This is fascinating. I wonder, Philip, if you could turn on your video so we could
I just did, sorry. I thought it was on, I didn't realize it wasn't.
Oh, that's super. Okay, well, I think we had a really wonderful presentations so far. I think as I know people are still sending in their questions, but while I collect these questions, maybe what I would like to do is to use my sort of chair's prerogative to ask all three of you one question, just to get the discussion going. And then I will begin to sort of gather and collect that question more specifically to each of the presentation. So my sort of one collective question for all three of you is that clearly COVID-19 has highlighted a real basic contradictions in essential work. Because on the one hand, the COVID pandemic has sort of brought to light the critical importance of essential work and services for our basic survival and social and economic functioning, whether it be health and personal care or food or domestic services. But on the other hand, it has also shown the systematic societal devaluation of this essential work and services. And that's why use of immigrants. So this is something about, I think, the nature of the essential work or services and our social and economic valuations of these work and services. So my question is, how is it that the work and services that are so essential to sustaining our livelihoods and society so systematically undervalued and devalued? I would love to hear a bit more from you, your thoughts and reflections on this.
Well, I can start since I was late. I can just
Sure.
say at the outset that, I think you have to maybe look at it, turn the cube a little and look at it differently. Essential also means police, fire, bus drivers, lots of people who are pretty well paid relative to their skills, not just in rich countries, also in poorer countries. They tend to be relatively well paid. When the three, healthcare is different because their wages are in the whole job ladder from the top to the bottom. Personal care, agriculture tend to be lower. But there's been, as you know, lots and lots of discussion about wage premiums for essential workers who were at lower wages, whether it's workers who work in warehouses or grocery stores or meatpacking plants. But we know that the the typical workers, at least in personal care and in agriculture, are typically people with relatively low levels of education and sometimes not a great knowledge of the local languages. I mean, there's a whole lot of factors, both personal factors and probably discrimination, that combine together to hold down wages in those sectors. And there's been lots and lots of efforts through fair trade programs, through a whole lot of unions, lots of things that try to change that basic equation. Many people in Europe who look at food chains blame the grocery stores for putting downward pressure on the prices of farmers, which in turn puts downward pressure on the price on farm wages. But this is an age-old discussion that is, I don't know how things will look. It'd be interesting to speculate how things will look if and when we get back to normal, whether there will be still these extra wage premiums that some employers pay to their hero frontline workers. It'll be interesting to see whether anything fundamentally changes. I think what I was trying to suggest, at least in agriculture, we didn't see really many fundamental changes.
Yeah, maybe Ito, I could follow up on Phil's answer there, because what I find really quite interesting in this discussion about the devaluation of care work and the incorporation of immigrants into that work. I mean, there's lots of elements to it, but I really think that gender is a significant element of this. And of course, gender is part of an intersectional framework when we look at multiple disadvantages. But I think, gender is a really basic form of segmentation in the labor market. And when you look at the health professions, as I mentioned in my slides, even when you look at the high end, women, physicians and surgeons are still being paid less, right? When you look at the other essential workers, fire and police, and we're very familiar with this in Canada, when women make claims on those occupations and on their right to be included, you see pushback, right? So the gender dimension, I think, is really an important function of that. And of course, we can go back to the biological dimension and the whole issue of social reproduction. So I would argue gender is an important part of the complex in terms of figuring out that sort of devaluation, but certainly within an intersectional framework.
Thank you, Margaret. Sabrina?
Yes, of course, on my side, I totally follow on Margaret and Philip as well in emphasizing in Margaret, especially emphasizing the gender dimension of these association between specific social groups and the most undervalued type of essential work. Actually, I think another point to be made is, I like very much how Encarnación Gutiérrez Rodríguez put it in a 2010 book, when she demonstrated how we do need to have the most stigmatized people associated to these jobs. Otherwise, these jobs will cost too much. So this type of discursive working that is made at the level of, how this work is socially constructed is also a way to make it cheaper for every family, cheaper for every household, cheaper for hospitals, cheaper for any industry that needs that work. But on the other side of another type of story, at the opposite side of this spectrum, I also like to mention strategies that domestic workers movements have taken in order to struggle against this stigmatization. And an example that I like to make, and is coming up in the work I'm doing with my team of the Dumical project. I don't have the time to mention all the names, but you can Google them. Is the example of the Colombian domestic workers movement. So it is mainly Afro-Colombian women who have achieved in recent years the recognition of care work as a portion of the GDP, the national GDP. So through this struggle, which is at the very symbolic level and in the economics of the country, of the national calculation of GDP, they're allowed to have a 13th installment, so the bonus, the end of the year bonus, which is normally recognized to all type of work, and it wasn't for care workers, and now thanks to them, it is. So there are strategies also to counteract this, well, seems very fixed and unchangeable kind of construction.
Thank you, Sabrina. These all very, very sort of provocative and interesting answers. Now I have a sort of bundled bunch of questions for each of you. Maybe I'll start with Margaret, because she presented first. There are questions about from Gloria Perez Rivera. What would be the impact of telemedical professions and unrestricted geographies, which I imagine as possibility to work from other countries for migrant workers who are already in Canada? Another question from Georgia Bonura, does a lack of recognition of foreign credential impact the uneven structures we see in the healthcare? And then finally from Naomi Alboem, what have the provinces put into place to facilitate the entry of IEHPs into health professions to assist with the pandemic work? Would you like to kind of answer them in one package?
Yeah, thank you.
Then I will move on to Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you, Ito, and thank you for the questions. So Gloria, yeah, that's a really interesting question about how is telemedicine going to influence migration processes. My sense is I think you're still going to need people to be in person. So we still need, as I argued, there may be tasks shifting and different kinds of interprofessional relationships going on, but we still need physical workers to be in place to care for bodies. But what I think is really interesting is what is going to happen in those sending countries, kind of more than what's going to happen in the receiving countries. Because you look at places like the Philippines, the fact that they have trained so many nurses to kind of go overseas, and when they don't go overseas, what happens is they become a resource that American telehealth companies go to Cebu in the Philippines, and they set up back processing offices to make use of all of this nursing, all of these nursing skills. So I think what's interesting is what's going to happen in the sending countries with regards to these transformations. And I think the work of Maddie Thompson is really interesting in this area. So I'd be happy to share references. She's done some work on this in the Philippines. On Georgia's question about the lack of credential recognition, and does it create a supply of well-trained or overtrained workers? I think in a way it kind of does, because it is a barrier to to the full incorporation of that migrant worker at a consummate level of their skills. But these other opportunities open up, and so they become a way of funneling them into some alternative. So whether it's conscious or not, the devaluation of foreign credentials creates a pool of surplus labor that can come into the long-term care process. And I'm just putting in the chat a link to a story map that I developed with some students looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and nursing migration pathways. Because what's interesting is in some ways there's a temporary engagement with personal support work while internationally educated nurses get their credentials recognized. So there's all kinds of temporalities to the intersectionality occurring across these labor groups. And so that I think is interesting to further examine. And then Naomi, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, there's some very interesting information here, some of which you kindly shared with me yourself. Manitoba certainly put in place a temporary pandemic registration for qualified internationally educated nurses. In Ontario, we've had a focus on international medical graduates who'd already passed their exams to practice. They were given a 30-day supervised medical license to help. Also, the same thing happened in British Columbia. So with, again, international medical graduates who had completed their qualifying exams were able to work with a doctor. And some of that information is available in that OECD report that I mentioned. And I can just put that in the chat as well for those people who want to engage with it. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And now here for a question from Perchinix, I think, I'm not sure the name, for Sabrina. I think it's coming from the EU context, I'm pretty certain. So the question is, in the EU core elements of union citizenship, freedom of movement and freedom to deliver services is based on care mobility from East to Western Europe. Many EU states, for example, Germany, Austria, Italy, have liberalized access to services. Now, this combination seems to be very toxic for care work, as it opens the door to bogus self-employment and exploitation. Is there a need to rethink of union citizenship as an invitation to exploit Eastern Europeans? And I would like to add to this, because you mentioned a bit about the role of public policies in shaping and dealing with the sort of domestic worker migration. Could you also add that to your answer?
Yes, thank you. I would like to answer to this question. I've seen the comment in the chat box, and it is indeed a very interesting point, and also maybe to say something about the technological aspect of this conversation, which I did not touch upon in my presentation because I don't have much data at European level, mostly on the Italian case. So I did want to make something more general. So let's say on the technology side of the story, I just quickly wanted to mention that there are several experiences in Italy of trying to use different types of technologies like tablets or counting in order to count the time and the tasks done by the people. This is done especially when caregivers are not working on a private basis, but for a small company, or in Italy they're called cooperative, but actually it's like small companies. And in this case, what happens is a very double thing. On one side, this is made in order to make the work more logic and structured in a better way and more also transparent, so you know what kind of service is provided. This is especially so when the service is partially at least paid by the public administration. So usually the patients are people in conditions that will receive state support or municipality support from the local municipality, financial support for the care provision they receive. For that reason, it's really important to know what kind of service has been provided, that service, to be accountable. At the same time, so from the point of view of managers, these companies' managers, this is a way to make the work more efficient, and this is the way to continue, to think about the future. This is the future of this type of work. Speaking with the workers, they actually feel these techniques to be techniques of control. So I don't know if you have seen the last Ken Loach movie, the one about the rider. The husband was the rider, but the wife was the caregiver. And so the movie is more famous for the husband, the delivery guy. But the story of her is actually fascinating. And you see how, for example, in counting the minutes, the elderly woman is throwing the soup on the floor. Do you count the minutes in which she's cleaning the soup on the floor or not? So for this very physical, what we call today essential work, technologies can easily turn into controlling machines rather than facilitating machines. I think this is the interesting part of the story for me, personally speaking. EU policies, again, thank you for this question. We are working on these. Also, Anna is now editing the special issue on temporariness of migration, which is these commuting circular patterns of migration between East and West Europe is key. Of course, these facilitated mobility between different European countries is a function many times to, as the question was say, bogus self-employment, is functional to the spread of agencies, so also the spread of some forms of exploitation made by agencies and employing households. At the same time, it's also about the freedom of movement of these workers who can easily go back home or go back to work as they need, as they want. Also, I want to emphasize that during the pandemic, the European Commission immediately said the movement between borders of Europe within the European Union, the borders were almost closed. It was instead granted for these type of workers. And that when all flights stopped in Europe, there were charter private flights in order to transport caregivers from Eastern Europe to Western countries. So, you know, this porosity of borders when it comes to this type of work is a very interesting topic. A very double-sided, I would say.
Thank you, Sabrina. I know we have only a few more minutes left. Questions are still coming, actually. And I'm reading it out. This time I want to ask Philip two questions from Yeoman Dinch and Louine Gaudring. I'm reading out because there are some people joining us via telephone, and they obviously cannot see the chat box. So the questions are, Philip, are there any studies on migrant foreign workers and their intention to stay as permanent residents in Canada, or for that matter, anywhere else? There is evidence on international students in Canada, for instance, that shows a strong interest in staying in Canada. It would be interesting to see as both constitutes a potential pipeline for immigration. The second question is, can you say more about loyalty? As you note, it's not same as indenture, but it's tight permit plus deportability equals good agricultural labor force. Does it add no path to permanent residency, as Jenna notes? And you have the Canadian model. Could you say something about this?
I think we can combine both questions. I mean, the point of a guest worker program is to bring people in and get them to leave. I mean, that they come in, fill a job, and then leave. And so there is no path under the US guest worker program, and I think under the Canadian one as well, from temporary to immigrant. You get no credit for having come back year after year after year for your experience, for your skills acquired, or you don't get points toward getting an immigrant visa or anything like that. And would people like to stay? I think many of them would. And one argument, remember, we have more unauthorized workers from Mexico than legal guest workers. It's now looking under the Biden administration as if the unauthorized workers may get immigrant visas, may get a path to immigration, permanent residence, and citizenship for them and their families, where the H-2A workers will not. They were non-immigrants. So one of the ironies is, if you have a very strict guest worker program, you may wind up not getting a path, where if you're unauthorized and there's a regularization program, you may get a path. It's happened before. The same thing happened in 1986. If you were a legal guest worker, there was no path. If you were unauthorized, you got a path. Loyalty, okay, this is the difficult thing. This is the pro and con, the trade-off. A guest worker has a contract with a guaranteed wage, whatever housing conditions, work conditions. The unauthorized worker does not. On the other hand, if the employer terminates, fires the guest worker's got to leave. The guest worker has no right to stay if he or she does not have a job. That is considered labor insurance. You bring in a crew of workers, they have to work for you, they can't go to work for someone else. Some people believe that visa portability is the answer. You let workers move from one farm to another. The logical issue with that is you would be bringing in people who would float from one farm to another within a sector. And they would have a certain amount of time between jobs before they too would become deportable. And we haven't tried it because right now, most countries have a job by job system. You have to search for Canadian workers first. If you don't find them, you can fill the job. It's not clear what would happen with visa portability. Europe obviously has it for Eastern Europeans who can move to the West. From everything we read, that has not prevented problems in meatpacking plants and other places that hire lots of posted workers from Eastern Europe. So, I mean, I'm not sure. We'll hear a lot about visa portability as the answer to exploitation in low-wage work like agriculture. I guess I'm a bit more skeptical that that's an easy solution, but it's certainly a debate we'll have much more. So, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Now, I know our time is up, but I would like to close this formal session now and invite you to stay and join us in the breakout coffee room. See you soon.